There's always this fear that they're going to come, somebody else is going to come and start to blossom and bloom and depose you. There's no way I can imagine anything good coming out of your growing up. See, if you grow up, I lose. Do you see how that works? If you get stronger, I lose. So I've got to do everything I can to keep you disempowered. And you know, there's some truth in that, isn't there? Because when a people starts getting more mature, they don't put up with tyrants. When they start feeling their own power, they find it harder to bend their knee.
Welcome to the third lecture on the King archetype within men's psychology by Dr. Robert Moore. In this talk, Dr. Moore will focus on the shadow side of the king and how it is linked to narcissism, infantile grandiosity, and human evil. He'll explore the two forms of pathology associated with the king archetype, the tyrant and the weakling, and describe the characteristics of men possessed by these energies. Moore also talks about how family dynamics and parental relationships influence these personality patterns, focusing on father figures. Join us as Dr. Robert Moore goes deep into the realm of masculine psychology, exploring the power and shadow of the king within you.
This topic about the pathology in the king, the pathology of the king, it's old hat for most of us because most of what we've seen is this. So, I mean, most of us could give this lecture. You know, because it's what we know best, but I'd like for us to focus in on think a little more systematically about king pathology or the way in which it manifests in this particular form. And what I want to do is do a little review of the basic, just a very quick review of the basic assumptions about narcissism, infantile grandiosity or pathological grandiosity, and the way it is the engine of all forms of pathology, and I think of all forms of human evil. And if you look at any of these archetypal configurations in the masculine and the parallels in the feminine, each one of them has its own particular way of manifesting pathological grandiosity. See, the queen has the queen's way of manifesting pathological grandiosity. The female warrior has that form and so forth. But I want to start out by just reviewing just briefly. When you're thinking about pathology from Jung's point of view, these archetypes are not pathological in themselves. They are what they are. In a way, they're nature. This is our biology. This is our biological given. You don't say that my muscle system is in itself pathological by design. It's pathological perhaps if I use it for certain evil ends, but it is a structure. It's a physical structure, a biological structure, and there is a sense in which. And read Anthony Stevens' work on our archetypes. Anthony Stevens' Archetypes and Natural History of the Self, and recently his book on war, The Roots of War. Because he really talks about these archetypal systems or configurations as biological. And I agree with him on that. And so the archetype itself is not good or bad. It's just one of the given potentials of the human animal. But remember, we talked about in Jung's view, you get into pathology when you get into inflation, either a positive or a negative inflation. Or we say today, we don't say inflation, although it's a perfectly good way to think about it. We say into a kind of a pathological grandiosity. I've given a number of lectures around the country on narcissism and human evil, in which I point out that for most of the history of the human race, tribal peoples understood this stuff, and they understood that there was a deep, close tie between creativity and evil, down at the roots. And that book, The Anthropology of Evil, it's a book published in England. I forget who the editor was, but The Anthropology of Evil goes into tribal views of this mystery down at the bottom of human experience, that creativity is somehow related to evil. Well, it is in this way in which both our creativity and our pathological grandiosity are grounded in the archetypal structures. So let me just review briefly with you the way in which all of the different major schools of psychoanalysis have had insights into pathological grandiosity as the root of psychopathology. Now, I've talked about this in other places, but let me just briefly run through this with you. How many of you have not been to previous sessions? Okay, but we have a few. Let me just talk just for a moment about Freud, Adler, Kohut, and Jung. Because when we're talking about the pathology of the king archetype, we have to set this in the context of the way pathology works, whichever one of these archetypes, the warrior, the magician, the lover, whatever. Okay. Each one of these great psychoanalysts have identified grandiosity in some form as related, as expressing itself in pathology. Let me just show you how this works. Now, Freud wasn't to the point yet of showing the relationship structurally in the psyche between the superego and the id in the way that we think of it today. Let me just say, the superego would be that part, we can talk about it as conscience, but it's really more than that. It is your inner critic. We talk about the inner critic. And when the superego is functioning right, it's helping you be aware of your limitations. And that's important. When it gets pathological, it doesn't just make you aware of your limitations, it grinds you into the ground. It can never give you anything. It can only criticize you. And so if you have what the early Freudians would talk about as a sadistic superego, it is always out of perfectionism. This is what Marion Woodman talks about as addiction to perfection. I mean, like it is so perfectionistic that it is constantly criticizing you and making you feel like you really don't have a right to live. If you really have severe depressions and you really have suicidal urges and fantasies a lot, then from a classical Freudian point of view, you'd say that you have a very punitive sadistic superego. Well, look at the grandiosity in that. The grandiosity is in its demands for a moral or aesthetic perfection that, in fact, human beings do not achieve. That is, it is that the sadistic superego applies perfectionistic, godlike claims on the individual. And so the grandiosity that you can see in the superego is in its claims for moral or intellectual or aesthetic perfection. And if I don't do better than this, if I'm a sculptor, and I'm working, and it doesn't come out just like my vision of it, then I break it and I stop being a sculptor. There are a lot of people that try and give up because they're so frustrated by their imperfection as a sculptor. Or if you started trying to write poems, and you wrote some poems, and then you made the mistake, as Robert Bly says, of showing your gold to the wrong people. You shared your poetry with the wrong people when you were very vulnerable, and their response kicks off your own inner superego sadism. And because when they look at it, one of these negative kings or negative queens looks at it and kind of gives you that look. And then your own inner critic turns up the volume then, and then you stop writing poetry. There are a lot of people, and we'll be talking next quarter about the lover archetype. There are a lot of people for whom the most healing thing they could do would be to write poetry. But because of this thing, they cannot pick up a pen. So the perfectionism of the inner critic. The id, according to the classic Freudians, is a perfectionism of desire. And a lot of the time, if it's real archaic and real grandiose, it's quantity. So many women, so little time. It's the guy you noticed at the bars, He's got a beautiful woman with him, but he only has eyes for them. Always, what? Not. Hey, you'll get me in trouble. Trump may have a hitman. I'm not gonna. But anyway, so the id is incredibly totalistic in its demands. It wants all the food. It wants all the cocaine. Wants all the alcohol. All the wild turkey. That's mine. My id wants all the wild turkey, and not that 86 proof stuff either. But anyway, it's got to have it all. Or if some of you are like some of us, it wants all the records, all the CDs. It's this acquisitive little god or goddess inside, and it can't. It's like the Stones song. It can't get no satisfaction. It's just the more it gets, the more it wants. And so there's a grandiosity of desire. But notice, both the moral critic and the desire are grandiose in form. Later on, in analysis with Kohut, we began to see that the grandiosity that drives what Freud thought is what he called superego, it is fueled by a structure which Jung called later the archetypal self, which we are talking about in this course, part of it. Now, Adler made it very simple. Adler, for those of you that haven't studied this stuff, Adler, Chicago is one of the few cities in the world that has institutes for all the major schools of psychoanalysis. My first psychoanalytic diploma was an Adlerian diploma. Adler was very simple about this. He says, practically everybody's got an inferiority complex. We've heard inferiority complex, and people to that extent have had some influence by Adler, because he coined that, inferiority complex. But what most people don't know is that Adler believed that behind every inferiority complex was a superiority complex. And in our language today, again, we would say, what is a superiority complex? Well, it is an unconscious organization which makes claims of the individual and of other people that are larger than human. In other words, the individual with the superiority complex feels that he or she should be exempt from the expectations that are made of other people. When an Adlerian speaks of someone who is a rule breaker, they're talking about someone with a superiority complex. I am above the law. You can see one side of the king pathology in that. See, I am above the law. Who's above the law? Well, the king is above the law in those primitive forms, those primitive cultures when there's no sense of the law binding the king after he's lost his sense of unity with it. Anyway, so inferiority complex and superiority complex, this is in the conscious mind. This is in the unconscious. So, grandiosity. For an Adlerian, how do you get healed? Well, you get help in finding where you're making these superiority claims without knowing it. The therapist not too gently exposes your claims to superiority. They have the Adlerians have a technical word for that. They call it spitting in your soup. That is exposing what they call the antisocial nature of the behavior, exposing the antisocial nature of the symptom. And their idea is that if you decide that you're going to come down and live as a fellow human being, you will have social interest. And so you see in that idea that getting off of they even talk about a hierarchical, there's this Adlerian book called Beyond Success and Failure, where they talk about how crazy a vertical oriented universe is. And that the crazier you are, the more vertically oriented your universe is. And that the more healthy you get, the more you're able to include in your realm of interest, care. See. Now, the feminists have picked up on this, although it's very interesting that feminist theorists have not made enough use yet of Adler. Many of them have not discovered Adler. But Adler's theory would support a lot of what contemporary feminist theorists are talking about. Okay, now Kohut and contemporary psychoanalytic self-psychology has gotten more clear about this stuff about grandiosity than anybody else, and I suggest that you look at this book by Miriam Elson called Self-Psychology in Clinical Social Work for an introduction to that school of thought and to Kohut's work, and then you can read, after that you can read Kohut himself. He's kind of a tough nut to read if you don't have a little help getting into it. But basically, that psychology is a brilliant approach to understanding how you end up with pathological grandiosity as an adult, what happened to you as a child that you still have it in raw forms, how it's related to your emotional and interpersonal problems as an adult. That whole school of thought is marvelously sophisticated, and the thing I simply wanted to point out tonight is the concept in Kohut of the person's need for mirroring. We talked about that a little bit before. And when we're talking about the pathology of the king, one of the things I want to talk about is if your relationship to the king is not good, what it does to your capacity to mirror others. See, we'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, the grandiose, exhibitionistic, if you like that, grandiose, exhibitionistic, self-organization. And here again, you've got this understanding that inside the psyche is an actual organization that is not your ego or it's not your conscious mind. That is what the Freudians say, very archaic and very primitive in its perfectionistic claims on you. For example, if you're working with a self-psychological psychotherapist, they're very comfortable helping you. In fact, they want to help you get a sense about the way the grandiose exhibitionistic self-organization operates in you. They're not going to moralize at you about it. What I really love about this school, they really understand that you got it honest. It isn't your fault. And what they will do is for example, they'll say, if you're a workaholic, nobody here but me, of course, is a workaholic. But if you're a workaholic, a self-psychological psychotherapist will try to help you become aware of the pressure of this thing to make you do more. And what is wonderful about these self-psychologists is they try to get you focused so you can watch at the involuntary nature of this. That this thing is like, like you're standing on a San Francisco hill trying to hold up one of those walls. It is an inexorable pressure on your conscious mind. You have to develop the capacity and consciousness to resist the grandiosity. And see, most schools of psychology can't even begin to deal with that kind of emotional experience. But self-psychology is marvelous at helping you get a feeling for the pressure on you to be great, the pressure on you to do more, the pressure on you to consume more. And the beautiful thing about it is that they've got it down to a sort of micro level so that you can really look closely. If you have an addictive problem, for example, get the book by Lewin, Lewin, Levin, called Treatment of Alcoholism and Other Addictions, a Self-Psychology Approach. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing, wonderful book. All of these things are just ways that I think are useful in helping you get a sense for the Jungian archetypal self that we're talking about through the king in this series. This structure functions very much like the superiority complex, like the grandiose exhibitionistic self-organization. It is in the psyche. It has a purpose, but if the ego of the individual identifies with it, then it blows him up into a caricature of a human being. At least what I believe to be a caricature. There are a lot of people today who believe that to be male is to be tyrannical. That by definition, masculinity is tyrannical. and dominating. Now, the assumption that I'm coming out of is that the tyranny that the human race has known has been a factor of what we're talking about tonight, a pathology of the king archetype. Chiefly a pathology of the king archetype. And that pathology takes two forms. And I wanted to spend some time before the break going into just discussing the two forms that this pathology takes. And then after the break, we can discuss a lot of the ramifications of it. Next week, I will try to go into some of the old and contemporary ways that people have tried to cope with this. The two pathological forms, we can use some of the stuff with regard to kingship. Usurpation and abdication. It's a way of thinking about this. What you find men doing when they do not form an inner conscious connection to this archetype is they will take a role of identifying with the archetype and acting it out. They will identify with it personally. And I'm going to talk about two of the major forms of that in a minute. Or they will project this on another man or another group of men. In other words, they treat this kingship business like a too hot potato. I do not want to hold this. Here, you take it. And if they can find, and there's always some narcissistic personality disorder or some antisocial personality around who will volunteer. Yeah, give it to me, boys. Let me refer you to the work of Theodore Millon, particularly an old book of his, an old textbook of his on psychopathology that I still think is probably better than anything else available today. And it's Theodore Millon's book, Modern Psychopathology. It's one of those big, old, expensive 1968 texts. But what Millon did, Millon is the guy, he's been on the committee, the committee writing, working on the diagnostic and statistical manual revisions. He's not psychoanalytically oriented, but he's done this wonderful thing that I think, in terms of helping people kind of map out psychopathology. I try to do that a lot in my teaching. He divides the psychopathological patterns into, let's see if I can do this, independent, dependent, ambivalent, and detached. He says that almost all basic patterns of psychopathology can be located somewhere in these categories, provided that you divide each of these into an active and a passive form. Stick with me now. I'm going to show you how this relates to the king archetype. Now these, in his later book, Disorders of Personality, he related these to the current formulations on character disorders, personality disorders. But what I think is very interesting, like for example, this would be sort of your asocial personality. This is what is poorly named today, the active ambivalent. The active ambivalent is what is poorly named today as the passive-aggressive personality. Passive-aggressive personality is not passive. They're really attacking you a lot. Passive-aggressive types, the way they talk about the DSM-3, really attack you a lot. Passive ambivalent is a compulsive personality. That's your that's your classical compulsive, which I located in my warrior class. See, these types, a lot of pathology in the warrior. But the king pathology you see most clearly in the dependent and independent forms that Millon has talked about. This is what is known today as dependent personality disorder. The passive dependent is called today the dependent. The active dependent is called today the histrionic. The passive independent is called the narcissistic personality disorder. And the active independent is today called it's called antisocial. What used to be called sociopathic. But the disorders, have you got that just in terms of this? The styles are different. They all manifest pathology. If you're looking at the king, what you're looking at, king disorders, the person who usurps the king archetype is active or passive independent. The person who abdicates the king archetype is a passive or active dependent. Okay, now that's complicated. I'll go over that with you in depth. Because I'm going to describe the person. How many of you saw David the King, like your assignment? Okay, now you got to see that before next week. King Saul, is a wonderful example of the active independent, the sociopathic, King Kong, King of the Mountain type pathology in the king. So we're going to talk about the more active form and the more passive form, especially of this, because they don't look the same clinically. But they're both grounded in the king archetype. Okay.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
To usurp the king in an active way, I can see, I'm trying to see when you say Solomon being active.
Not Solomon, Saul.
Saul being active, independent.
Maybe a different story. See, the key. Let me talk a little bit about an active independent personality, what they're like. the way emperors have been viewed throughout history corresponds very well to these two, and in terms of their attitudes toward the intrigues around them, they really correspond a lot to this. This person is paranoid to the core. They're constantly scanning. If there's not a palace coup, they will invent one. Their view of the universe is totally vertical. If I'm not standing on your neck, you're standing on mine.
A Stalinist.
And so this is a Stalinist view. And if you want, well, that's right. But let's Richard Nixon was excuse me, what's my language? He was a pansy here compared to Stalin. I mean, Stalin had this down. I mean, the way you got killed in Stalinist Russia is being a really good Bolshevik general. I mean, if you really wanted to get killed, just be a really good, ideologically clean Bolshevik general. And he would be sure to single you out to be shot. And that is the essence of this active independent thing. When it's really florid, which it is if a person is in that particular form of identification with the king, this is the archetypal configuration of the preemptive strike. You will not allow, get this now, and think about it in terms of the role, the true role of the king. The true role we were talking about earlier last week. The true role of the king is to elicit cosmos from chaos. When a person is into this active independent thing, they want to create chaos everywhere they can. They do not want organization forming. You can think about the father in the dysfunctional family. You do not want any organization forming. Why? Because if there's any organization that forms, it can be used as a base to operate against you. Get that? So the pathological expression of the king in this form is anytime anyone begins to get any organization going, you have to destroy them.
That's the true tyrannical leader.
Yes, the true tyrannical leader cannot emotionally, it is impossible for that person to let any base of community organization proceed beyond a certain level. It happens, if you just study carefully the Sunday New York Times every week. Just use it as a psychological text and study carefully events all around the world. You will see this happening constantly. The tyrants always move against any organizations that they are not totally dominating. For example, friends of mine just got back from the Philippines. And they had been working with these small community organizations. And just right before they got there, a group of individuals had come in to murder the village leaders. They had just murdered some village leaders. And, it's very interesting. Some of the people in the village thought it was the government troops or agents of the government troops. Some of the people in the village thought it was the Communist People's Army. But what they need to realize, and very few people realize, it doesn't matter whether it was capitalist or communist. Because the actual reality that's operating there is this, and it doesn't have an ideological label. See, it's widely represented among communists and capitalists, among the left wing and the right wing. The left wing and the right wing both have plenty supply of these individuals. And their ideology is only skin deep.
I was just going to say, it seems like the U.S. Our people like that are so bunglers, usually they miss the target. Yet on the other side, usually they have a detachment that allows them to hit the target.
Right. Well, yeah. You know, if you're going to do this, you really got to be into it. I mean, you can't be Jimmy Carter and do this. You know, I won't get into that, but I mean, and when a guy like Jimmy Carter is up against one of these, Carter never understood really what he was dealing with. And see, once you ever understand this kind of personality, then there's a certain sobering that occurs to you. You know, all those fantasies about putting the flowers into the gun barrels and somehow achieving world peace, you know, that begins to evaporate on you. Because this type of an individual has no sense whatsoever of any moral limits. You can see the old kingship archetype there. Not I am the state, I am the laws, I make the laws. They are a law unto themselves, and their law is power. Power over. This is when the feminists talk about patriarchy and the essence of the power over thing. This is one of the imagos they're seeing, and it's very real in history. Study Caligula. Get some Roman history and study Caligula. You see it very clearly in Caligula. But what I think we have to understand in studying this archetypal stuff is that Caligula was the same guy as Stalin. I mean, this is not personal. This is archetypal. These individuals are only superficially individuals. What we're seeing is what happens when the king archetype comes in and possesses an ego and expresses itself in this particular form. There's a more benign form, you know. I mean, it's not as incredibly toxic in the same sense. This passive form, this is what we talk about as the narcissistic personality disorder. And basically, you know, a narcissistic personality disorder, if you just adore them and admire them and mirror them, they calm down. You know? I mean, they kind of get lulled into sleep if you mirror them. Every graduate student that ever figured out graduate programs knows that their narcissistic professor, that all that narcissistic professor wants is to be admired and mirrored and made to feel that they're absolutely the most brilliant professor that ever existed and their ideas are wonderful. And yes, I would love to write my dissertation on your research and let you publish it. I mean, and if you mirror a narcissistic personality disorder enough, they will stop attacking you. And they will start feeling like they're connected with you. And if you can kind of move into a mirroring point of view with them, it's bogus, of course, but they start feeling attached to you. And they won't attack you anymore as long as you're kind of in there mirroring them. You're one. And that's a big difference. See? Because don't ever try to flatter one of these. Don't go in and try to mirror an active independent. They'll smile at you. and have them come get you. See, because you see the difference is this person is a little more naive than this. The passive independent, the narcissistic personality disorder, wants so badly to be mirrored and admired that he will believe you when you tell him how wonderful he is. He needs to believe you so bad. Yes, but just keep talking. Tell me how wonderful I am. But there's a little capacity for self-deception there. Whereas the active independent personality doesn't trust anybody at all, period. And so when you come in trying to flatter and tell them how wonderful they are, they're thinking to themselves what? What are they thinking when you're flattering them? What do you want? Or, I wonder if he's organizing against me. You look at the way Saul related to David. When David was truly loved Saul, Saul knew that was phony. See the paranoid quality? Can you see the difference between these two forms? They're both the king archetype. One of them is much more paranoid than the other. One of them is much more compulsively violent than the other.
They would act almost bipolar, would they fall into a bipolar response where you can have this?
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
One extreme, passive.
That's right. That's right. That's right. But you see, they really are distinct because, for example, what you get with the passive independent one is you get lots of rages when they're not adored enough. And you can, when a person is into this passive form of this, you can tell when they're about ready to fragment because they start getting irritable. They're not attacking you yet, but they're just getting irritable. And you can tell that their anxiety level is going up. And the people in organizations that have bosses or managers that are like this, they learn that that's when to go in and really pay attention and stroke the boss. And then it usually calms down, see. So in other words, when he really flies into a rage and starts attacking everybody, it's usually when somebody has wounded his glow. See. But this other character, that's not his desire to destroy you, is not dependent upon whether you didn't mirror him enough. He just wants to see any sign whatsoever that you're looking like you think you can function independent. See? And it doesn't matter whether you've praised him to the skies, because he's really not looking to you for that. He's much more inner. You talk about this, the active independent. You would talk about him as much more inner motivated. He doesn't give the other people that there's much power over him as a narcissistic personality disorder in the classical sense would do. Yeah.
Was the meeting of Hitler and Chamberlain an example of that? Hitler being the active, Chamberlain being passive. Hitler mirrored Chamberlain, calmed him down, sent him to bed, and he knew all the time what he needed to do. And the lesson perhaps was that another active independent has to meet him face to face for him to back away.
I think Hitler he needed some of the adulation, but finally, I think you're right. I think that really wasn't finally critical for him. He was more interested in watching how he could manipulate things. It was very interesting to see Hitler and Stalin dealing with each other, see, because that was quite a twosome. Yeah. And Mussolini, look at Mussolini. Mussolini was far more the narcissist type. You know, he loved to strut, and he loved to have everybody watch him preen, but he really was not in the league of the others. He really wasn't in the same league. Yeah.
Can you explain why I'm unclear about what the title usurpation?
When you speak of usurping the throne, someone who takes the throne when the throne is not really meant for them. Remember when I was talking about the development in kingship, in the history of kingship, when the king began to understand that he was not the final king, that there was a king of kings and a lord of lords to whom he had to submit. So there is a sense, even say in the ancient Near East, in which some of those kings had developed to the point that they knew that they had to answer to a cosmic king, that they indeed were kings, but that they were not going to usurp the cosmic throne. So there was that development from when the Pharaoh thought he was the cosmic king, until later when the king was the deputy of the cosmic king. And you really see that in a lot of the Christian imagery. Like last week, I found this very primitive Thai folk art in which they had tried to do a rendering of the, I should have brought that tonight, the three kings of the Christian Advent, because it really gets at that sense about the Christian myth that you get in Handel's Messiah, the idea of the kings coming and paying homage to the cosmic king. There is that same structure. And when you say usurpation in this, it's any individual that, in our language, that takes the role of the archetypal king. No man. See, the assumption here, what is the assumption? The assumption is any man will be crazy who either takes this for himself or puts it on another man. See? That is, you can be crazy by identifying with it, but you're equally crazy when you give it to another human person. Because when you give this to another human person, we might as well get into that, the effect is totally disempowering. And if you want to study the way this works in a personality disorder, just look at the dependent personality disorder. Because the dependent personality disorder does not want any of this king stuff. Do not give me any responsibility. I do not deserve it. If you give it to me, I will fuck it up. And if you don't believe me, try me. And, well, that's really the passive dependent. What we call the dependent personality disorder is what Millon calls the passive dependent. And this person, the passive dependent, for those of you that are real interested into archetypes, they talk about the way in which Persephone, in Boland's book on feminine psychology, she talks about Persephone, the Persephone myth. Persephone, it carries a lot of this passive dependent quality. So we're talking about the man who is sort of the male version of Persephone. Persephone is the the girl who's with her mother and is dragged down into the underworld by Hades and raped and held prisoner against her will. Hades, who's Hades? The king of the underworld, the lord of the underworld. And so you can say that in a way, any dependent personality has in effect been taken into the underworld, has been abducted in a way by the unconscious. You can say that the king, their king is definitely in the underworld because they're looking for somebody to give this authority to give this power to, this responsibility and care. And that's what you see a lot in marriages. You see a lot of dependent personality types marry independent types. It makes total sense archetypally. If I'm out of touch with my king, I'm going to find somebody that's real in touch with it. And I'm going to sign them up to carry it for me. And of course, I will feel very morally superior to them because they're not using it very good. They're not using it very well. But the shadow of the dependent personality, the Jungian terms of the shadow, that is, in the unconscious of the dependent personality is one of these king figures. It's just that the individual does not want to deal with the responsibility of coping with that. The responsibility. Too much.
That's out like the bewitched man in thing in that relationship to the
I think that's the male version of it. Here's the root.
Where he gives away his kingship to a queen that is very demanding.
Yeah. Actually, he's probably projecting his king on her masculine side. And there are a lot of women who are much more in touch with their king than men. But a lot of the time in that kind of relationship, again, the form of the royalty is a very shadowy form because it likes domination. See, there's the rule. Anytime you're in a pathological relationship to the king, either form, you like domination. It's sadomasochistic. Do you see that? I mean, because if your ego is consciously identifying more, this is sadistic as hell. And this is more masochistic. So, in any case, domination is a value in either form of it. Yeah, somebody else had their hand up. Yes.
Hi, I'm having trouble clarifying what is the main difference between the active and the passive dependent.
Well, in terms of the archetype, let's just stay with the archetype. If you study emperors or kings, sometimes they sit on their throne or go to their window and bless the people or sit there on the dais and have audiences, have people come in and present themselves. I'll knight you, do all this sort of thing. But I'm there in the throne room. That is when chaos is not threatening too much. The king is on the throne when chaos is not threatening too much. When chaos begins to threaten the realm, the king doesn't stay on the throne. You just look at history and myth. When chaos begins to threaten, the king gets off the throne. And he puts on the armor. And he gets out the sword. and he goes right for the bridge of the nose of whoever is coming into the kingdom. In other words, he becomes much more warlike. He becomes the essential commander-in-chief. You follow that? So the emperor, just think of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar wasn't always sitting there on the throne. He was a general at the head of the legions. See? So when you're thinking of this the active independent, in terms of the archetype, you think of the king in that head of the army's role, see, which is sort of the essential image of the warrior, the archetypal warrior in his fullest sense is the king on the warpath. So, the king with the sword in his hand to do battle. Because, see, the active independent's always doing battle. There's never a time when the active independent is not always either doing battle or preparing to do battle. Constantly vigilant, constantly paranoid, see. So, just as you can see in the archetype, in the myths, just look at the myths. Sometimes Zeus goes to war. Sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes the Ulysses goes off to war. Sometimes he doesn't. So it's an active and a passive mode. There's probably something about that built in to us biologically. A lot of studies of chimpanzee culture now. And what Doug Gillette and I've been looking at is the way in which a lot of these behaviors associated with kingship are in chimpanzee culture, right up front. And the more we learn about it, the more we realize that we really do have to study primate behavior. Because not to study it is to miss out on some of the things we have to deal with. Yeah.
Then if you could point out the main difference between active and passive and the dependent of the application.
Well, the active dependent, again, place to really get a real good take on this is in Millon's later book called Disorders of Personality. But that's what we call the histrionic. And a histrionic, you might say they're always looking for the king. And, gee, I think it may be you. And so I'm going to see if I can charm you and get you to choose me. Well, as soon as I charm you and you choose me, then I kind of thought it might not be you. And I think it might be you. The histrionic is always going around looking for the king. And there's this pattern in the histrionic personality, male or female, and there are a lot of people who say, well, there are no male histrionics, but there are a lot of male histrionics. They're always going around looking for the true king. There are people that have been in 14 different cults. And they go to one and they think they found the true king. Then they discover the clay feet. And then they go to another one, look for the true king. And so it is a different pattern in that with the passive dependent, boy, you get to be a king for that person. You're in it until the half Nelson around there that they got around your neck, breaks. Narcissistic personality cannot stand anybody having any autonomy or separate value either. So the distinction I would make between the passive dependent and the active dependent is that the passive dependent is sure they found author. And the active dependent is still looking. And anytime they find a king who acknowledges them, then they know they got the wrong one. And they move on. Histrionics are compulsively promiscuous at this level, not necessarily sexually, but they flit about from allegiance to allegiance, because when they make their allegiance, they make it really enthusiastically. They do everything enthusiastically. They make it enthusiastically. This is sort of an Elizabeth Taylor kind of being, or Richard Burke. They make it, and they're very excited about it, but it ages quickly. And then they're on. There's this literary concept that applies here. It's called, have you ever heard of sedimentation? So it's something talked about in literary criticism. Sedimentation. It's that quick death that any insight has, or any commitment or any meaning. For a while there, I thought there was a hierophany, and then I realized it was just indigestion. Hierophany, manifestation of God. So anyway, you can almost see, it's like if you're a histrionic personality, and a lot of people that we talk about borderline personalities, borderlines typically are sort of just very severe manifestation of this pattern. And see, you can see that a person who is in this active dependent mode has been disappointed so many times by the kings in their life. Their trust has been broken so much that they're always super careful. They kneel at your knee, you're the king, they kneel at your knee and they say, yes, I will serve you faithfully, I think. Or till I don't feel like serving you faithfully. You get that? You feel that? Can you feel that in your bones? I mean, you ought to be able to feel that in your bones because the wounds in us, and lo and behold, old dad, our experiences with father have a lot to do with how this gets set up. Because if you've had a lot of disappointments in father, if father's been very unpredictable, and not particularly violent, you may end up this way. If you've had a really acting out violent father and you're a man, then you can end up in any of these things, really. But it's less likely that you end up with this narcissistic form, unless your father was outgone a lot and you were left to your mom, who tried to make up for what your dad did to you. If dad was around a lot and was abusive, really abusive, it would be harder for you to have ended up a real shiny narcissistic personality disorder. It's kind of hard to maintain a really nice, shined up narcissistic personality disorder if your dad has really been abusing you a lot, beating the hell out of you a lot, constantly criticizing you, constantly running you down. It's harder to turn out sort of a glowing puer with that kind of father. Present. If he's present, It's easier if your father's that kind of man and you were born with the kind of physical build that gave you hope when you were a little boy, that when you got 16 you could kill him. Then an active independent father tends to generate an active independent son. See, if the boy thinks he could ever take him on. If the father is 6'4" and the son is 5'4", then the chance is that the son will probably get located in one of these others. A lot of the time, the son's sense of his own power is so totally devastated by the father that he will be more passive dependent and will often, as some of you pointed out, marry a very strong woman. Yeah.
I also was going to say that passive dependence, isn't that more likely also to be a male brought up in a female-dominated family? In other words, where there is no male.
It can be. It can be that very often as well. If the women are very, very powerful and his power has never been, his masculine power has never been validated. Yeah, that's right. That can. But what you got to understand is when old dad is in the Saul mode or the Stalin mode, and he is attacking any glimmer of masculine power in the son. He calls in an airstrike anytime the son even looks like he has any self-esteem. Then even if dad is home, the son will not be able to consolidate any masculine self in any kind of healthy way. There are a lot of guys that have grown up in families where the father was an alcoholic, where the son never has any. He can never be sure when this killer king is going to emerge. I mean, dad can be really nice sometimes, but when he gets to drinking, the killer king comes out and starts blasting the son. And a lot of the time, you will see these patterns where in fact, you see this often, of extremely powerful alcoholic father, whether he admits he's alcoholic or not, who can be very, sometimes, pillar of the community, etc., pillar of the church, blah, blah, blah. And then when he's drinking, this thing comes out. And there's a rule for this thing. No quarter. There's no quarter for this thing. There's no inhibiting of aggression for the active independent. Yeah.
About the family structure without the male, without the adult male, is that my experience now, I've got dealing with some people that the majority of them don't have a father image in the family. And they seem to be just pendant personalities to, it's almost surprising.
Yeah.
The numbers.
Well, let's think about that and come back and talk about that more. We can talk about what happens to this energy in that kind of case. There are various things that happen. There's also tends to issue in narcissistic personality disorders, though. I mean, if the mother really assigns the son the role as her champion, and my Adonis, then you'll get a narcissistic personality disorder. There are a lot of people that are assigned this role that go into priesthood and the ministry and a lot of other kind of professions where the mother has just really made this boy into a god because there's no adult male around to let's talk about in terms of family triangulation after the break too. Let's take about 5 or 10 minute break and come back and we'll discuss this. asked a question that's really important, and I wanted to share with you. He was asking, he said, well, now last week we were talking about the positive qualities, the positive potentials. And is there any counterpart to those in the pathological expression? Or is that just a totally separate thing? And I really appreciate his asking that because it's quite clear. And just think about it, do it this way. When you get the shadow expressions of the king, particularly in this form, let's look at this first. Whereas when the archetype of the king and the masculine personality is functioning, doing what it's there for, it enables the attempt on the part of the man to create cosmos and to facilitate the emergence of cosmos wherever he can get it to rise. You can almost think about the kings trying to dance Atlantis back to the surface. Think about it. The king always dances. You watch that movie, David the King, it's really wonderful because it really catches, you know, if you think it's kind of funny watching Richard Gere trying to dance. I mean, he isn't a great dancer, but the idea in those dance scenes is accurate to sacral kingship because he's dancing and he dances in there. It's a great jubilee. But the idea of the dance of the king, and you can see that really clearly in those Shiva statues. You know, what are they called? The Shiva statue where it shows the dancing Shiva. There's a name that I can't pronounce it. But anyway, it's the dancing cosmic lord. What he's doing, he's dancing the world into existence out of chaos. And so the king dancing is always trying to dance that up fully, get it fully danced up. And that's why he's dancing the four quarters. He dances this quarter, and then before that, he sinks over there. He runs back over here. He dances this one, and he dances this one. It's very important for the king to dance all the quarters. You get a feeling of the fragility of cosmos. That, see? Get that? It doesn't just, you put it up, it doesn't just stay up. It's like a juggler. You know, you don't just put it up over here and then walk over here and that part of the cosmos stays up. The king has got to keep dancing. Okay. Now, when you're the shadow king, it's just the opposite. Anytime any cosmos organizes, you try to destroy it. Oh, I see a little patch of cosmos coming up over there. And let's go over there and stomp it out. You know? And you can watch organizations that have this kind of leader. They cannot stand anybody having any initiative or any independent ideas or building any kind of independent operations that they have not got total hegemony over. So anyway, this person wants to keep chaos so that their order is chaos. You can see why this is the imago of the shadow king. That imago in the Christian tradition has always been Satan. See? Because Satan always tries to sow division and chaos everywhere. The whole mythology of the king of the demons in all these different spiritual traditions, all the major spiritual traditions have an image of the king of the demons. And the king of the demons destroys order wherever it can find it. See? Yes?
Order in the chaos, Satan has a reflection of Satan.
It's a certain ordering, right. There's a certain order. in that it is organized disorder. It's organized by this constant monitoring and preemptive strike. You don't allow any world to come up which has any independence. You got to think about it. I mean, the world as it comes up, it's like the Soviet economy. You manage it from Moscow, and you've got to make sure you make every decision on every pair of shoes. Does it get a brown sole or a blue sole? And then you wonder why the supply of shoes doesn't work too well, because you're trying to manage every little aspect. Kills spontaneity and creativity in that kind of form. The sacrifice, the true king, the true role of the king archetype in the male personality, in the mature male personality, is to enable that sacrificial thing we were talking about last week. That is, doing what is necessary that the realm flourish. And that's always sacrificial in some sense. It's always a price on the part of the king. The essence of the king is sacrifice. And again, I pointed out that that's clear in all these different traditions. You can even see it in, whatever you think about the way the Roman Catholics do the Mass theologically, whatever you think about the fact that Roman Catholics, that the priest does not give the cup to the laity, but gives the host. You can see the archetypal stuff behind that, because the priest, archetypally in that, represents the king. And it is the king who drinks the cup. That is an image of sacrifice. It's the king who drinks the bloody sacrifice. That's a sacrificial image. And then feeds the laity. That is the image. That's the image of sacrifice and kingship. So if you're a Protestant, and you can't stand the idea that the priest doesn't also give out the cup, that's fine. And of course, if you really got down underneath that stuff and said, well, Protestants think that everybody ought to have to be into that sacrifice thing too, you could follow it up. But in the Roman Catholic version, you can see that king archetype function there. It's the king who sacrifices that the world may be fed. Now, notice what the shadow king does. The shadow king is in the sacrifice too. Right? I'm going to sacrifice you. You're it. I will sacrifice you when I need you. And so they're equally into sacrifice. It's just the question of who's the goat. So, he's a sacrificer. And in terms of the biblical tradition, if this guy had been Abraham, he would have definitely have sacrificed Isaac. Fathers who are into this are happy to sacrifice their sons. Yeah, Bill.
This shadow king is extremely conservative. It wants no other structure but its own. So it resists any kind of transformative process.
Right.
To result in its own unwinding.
It's anything that would result in its own limitation. Any power base that would limit my powers. And so it would not, if when it's in a Chinese leader, it does not like all this talk about democracy in China. it would see all that talk about democracy as being anarchy. See? All these students want is anarchy. So we need to send in the tanks.
But it limits its own growth.
Oh, yes.
It resists any kind of regeneration.
Right. It's like, that's an excellent point too, because you see that, you look at all the myths, forget the theology and look at the mythic structure of the story of Herod and the birth of Christ, because that makes Bill's point. It's like in the Christian myth, Herod is the shadow king. And the idea is that this new kind of king is going to try to empower everyone. And so you have to kill this thing, because you see that in its growth, you will find yourself limited or done away with. You see it also in the Jewish story of the Passover. The idea that in the birth of Moses, the hero, what people talk about is the hero, birth of the hero, and how the hero is always under attack. That is, you can see that in this structure. That is, the old king doesn't want any expansion of empowerment, and so does everything he can to kill it. You can see that in a lot of different stories. You see it in Saul, you see it in Herod, a lot of other traditions. You see it most clearly there, I think. Okay. Stewardship. There's no stewardship here. Why can't there be stewardship on the part of the Shadow King?
King has to subdue the earth and like totally rape it, exploit it.
Yeah. The concept of steward, you are a steward for someone else. You are keeping this for someone else when you're a steward. Stewardship, remember we talked about last week, stewardship is not ownership. This person stewards, this person feels that he possesses. Yeah. I mean, it's like when the feminists talk about patriarchy, they are doing a phenomenology of shadow kingship. Because in patriarchy, rather than any kind of sense of stewardship, which does not get into tyranny and dehumanization, you get the treatment of not just the woman and her body as property, but everything in that way. Everything in what you might call in creation is not seen as creation. It's not seen as divine. It's not seen as having any intrinsic value. Its value is what I say it is. It's a fascinating thing. There is no stewardship. There can be no stewardship because this guy thinks it's his to do with what he will. And it's very fascinating. A man that is into that is possessed with this king thing, he knows nothing but throw away people. The whole stuff in the literature about the narcissistic personality disorder male, he only exploits because that's all he knows. He can't have a sense of caring. He cannot help it. He simply, his system for caring is not up. So he is into this, I will use you until I no longer choose to use you, and then I will use somebody else. And blessing, what do we get instead of blessing? Damning curse. A curse. The eye of blessing. The eye of blessing always empowers, engenders, elicits the essence of what is there and has it come out. The eye of the evil eye, malokio, the eye of cursing, when it looks at you, it seeks to wither you because it fears you. This is at the root of envy. See? Because when you're in this, when you're possessed by this king thing, you, particularly in that paranoid form, it's a tremendously fearful mode of being in the world. You may have a lot of firepower, you know. You may have a lot of tanks. You may have a lot of helicopters. But you're always worried about those guerrillas. Because you know they may have been equipped by those latest anti-tank grenade launchers. And they may have been equipped with heat-seeking missiles. And your choppers don't work too well when the guerrillas have got heat-seeking missiles. And so there's always this fear that they're going to come, somebody else is going to come and start to blossom and bloom and depose you. There's no way I can imagine, there's no way I can imagine anything good coming out of your growing up. See, if you grow up, I lose. Do you see how that works? If you get stronger, I lose. So everything, I've got to do everything I can to keep you disempowered. And you know, there's some truth in that, isn't there? Because when a people starts getting more mature, they don't put up with tyrants. When they start feeling their own power, they find it harder to bend their knee. See? And you know, when the men in a culture mature, and all these things we've been talking about, but you know, the king thing in a man starts to get stronger. He starts having some sense of responsibility. And that warrior thing in a man starts to get stronger. That means he starts to feeling like if he doesn't have the firepower, he might just get it. It would be a fearsome thing in the city of Chicago if the men of Chicago started feeling their king and their warrior energy very powerfully. It would be a fearsome thing, because you might just have a combination of caring with the capacity for some decisive action against the chaos in this city. See, it would be frightening for all the drug dealers. Yeah.
Isn't there a way in which the Shadow King relates differently dynamically to the usurpation or the abdication?
Absolutely. What would you say? He's saying, isn't there a way that the Shadow King relates to the usurpation thing? Go ahead. What would you see?
Well, for example, you know, in terms of the the tyrant who is definitely, creating chaos. The first is abdicating. It'd be like chaos would be seeking really him out, because in the sense that he is not acting out from a king, it's from a dependent standpoint, and so chaos is going to overwhelm him.
You mean the dependent person?
Yeah. The dependent person.
See, the dependent person, though, the dependent person is really trying to find somebody to lend some order to their life, without them having to pay any price for it. See, if you're a dependent personality, the last thing you want to have anything to do with is sacrifice. See, people think they're the dependent is sacrificial. Dependent is not sacrificial. Dependent personality wants to find somebody that they can latch on to that will provide order for their existence without them having to make any sacrifice. One of the things, if you ever do any therapy with a dependent personality, you're going to have your patients try. A dependent personality disorder is extremely difficult to treat because life is just too hard for they feel for them. See? It's like, don't ask me, if you work with a dependent personality disorder, they would go to college, but my God, all that studying. Other people can do that, but it's because they were born with more gifts than me. You get that? It's genetic, Doesn't matter that I have an IQ of 147. I could never do that. And you can see now, right there, just stay with that a minute, because you can see the hidden inflation of the dependent personality. That king hasn't disappeared. It's in there in the unconscious, leading to an inflation. And as the Adlerians are wonderful about this. They're better than any of the other psychoanalytic schools. If an Adlerian spots a dependent personality disorder, they immediately assume manipulator. The dependent personality to an Adlerian is somebody that's got a good thing going. But anyway, so your idea of looking at the relationship between the dependent and the king is really something you ought to think about a lot. Because it is an inflation too. See, it's really intriguing to look at the inflation in both of these dependent forms. The grandiosity there. Because the dependent is really grandiose because, I would be a king, but there's too much sacrifice involved. And the histrionic is, I got high standards for you. Right? A histrionic always has high standards for you. And you always flunk. They always think you're going to measure up. They sleep with you a few times and then they decide you don't measure up. It's amazing. Other comments or questions? I think that you get a little sense about the pathology of kingship here. But you just look at this thing. It is really, people talk about vampires. This Shadow King stuff is very much like vampire stuff. It drinks your blood. It wants to have something to do with life. It wants to take yours. See? And it's your Shadow King stuff where you either deny any pretensions to grandiosity, or you totally legitimate your own claims to grandiosity. All that stuff is in the service of death. See? And you can see why. Because to identify, there's nothing more unstable than identifying with the king archetype. It doesn't matter how much firepower you have. When you identify with this thing and become a tyrant, somebody is going to be plotting to kill you. See? And look at the paradox of it. See? If you create the army you need, in this, think about it a minute. If I'm a tyrant and I create the army I need to maintain my hegemony, I have got to create some powerful general. And I've got to create some generals who are strong enough to think for themselves, or my army won't be any good. And the minute I do that, I'm at risk. You see that? Yeah. And since they know me intimately, since my generals know me intimately, they know that I deserve killing. Yeah.
I was going to say with stewardship.
Yeah.
Seems to me that what destroys a healthy stewardship a lot, at least in our time, is advertising makes everybody a king on the side of owning and possessing.
That advertising makes everybody a king.
Exploits, a pathological kingship in everybody.
Well, if he's saying that advertising really exploits that thing, and you can see that if you are already set up in this pathological king stuff, you will have a void at your center. You get that? If you are trying to parade yourself around as the king of kings and the Lord of lords, you know that's a fraud inside. That's why Saul was so nervous. That's why Herod was so nervous. You know you're a fraud. And so there's a hole in there, and everybody can exploit that hole. And advertising can say to you, well, I can tell you how you can fill that hole. You wouldn't feel so empty if. They would all love you if.
Yeah, the hook has to be in you, or the advertising doesn't work.
Yeah, that's right. I can tell you how you can fill this void, and you can feel as secure and centered and calm as you try to look. See, by definition, and from a Jungian point of view, if your ego is identifying with an aspect of the archetypal self, you will be carrying massive anxiety. Why? Because your ego isn't designed to deal with that. It's like plugging a 110-volt coffee maker into 220,000. That's not made for that. So you're going to carry enormous anxiety if you are sitting on the throne of the king archetype. Even the most together talented narcissistic personality disorder is at bottom very anxious, because they've had the experience of running into people that did not adore. Yeah.
I would say easy credit exploits more than advertising.
Easy credit?
Yeah. I'm having troubles with stewardship and
possession.
Here, in terms of emotional jargon, disowning feelings, owning feelings.
Oh, yeah.
Codependency in terms of managing other people's feelings. Yeah. How would that fit in here with? It seems to me.
Well, that the idea of owning your feelings that we use in current culture is a different kind of thing. It's not. It doesn't have the. It doesn't have the. It doesn't have the connotation about being a total totalitarian about this thing. That is, to own your feelings, as they say in Gestalt psychology or something, it really doesn't mean owning them at all. It means to acknowledge them and to respect them and to let them be what they in fact are. If you go to a Gestalt therapist, he's not going to teach you to act like you can take your feelings or leave them. The Gestalt therapist is going to teach you that you must respect them for what they in fact are. And that is not owning as you might own a styrofoam cup or something like that. So that's a different use of the word own. When they say own, they mean to allow that into consciousness so that it can receive the respect that it's due it. To honor is really a better phrase for what they mean by that. Now the other thing you said, there was another thing that you were pointing to other than the issue of owning. What was the other one?
Disown.
Yeah.
How about responsibility?
Oh, the codependency thing. Yeah. Well, this is when you but you see here, when you're a dependent personality type and you marry a narcissistic personality disorder, that is codependency. Anybody who is consciously relating to the king archetype, any male who's consciously relating to the king, is going to be concerned about other people's feelings, but is not going to be into the idea that he can live their lives for them. With an internal connection with the king, you're into empowering people. When you're into empowering people, you're not into doing it for them. So the empowerment concept is very key here. Empowerment, disempowerment. When you're into a conscious internal connection with this thing, you want people to grow up. Your fundamental agenda is for people to achieve their individuation. Codependency is an agreement that you make with somebody else that neither one of you will grow up. I mean, in codependency, you and I agree that we're going to totally let our little personal problems totally organize the world. We're going to create our own little mini cosmos here with all of its many little chaoses. And we're going to live our lives as if there were no external world. It's really intriguing to watch. This grandiosity will always try to generate bogus centers in families, in organization. And codependency is a way of kind of creating bogus centers. You are the center of my life. And I'm going to occupy myself dealing with you as the center of my life. See, archetypally speaking, for a man, the king is the center. And the man who is connected with the king archetype does not look to anybody else to be his center. Not a woman, not a boss, not a father. Get it? Now that is a hard word, because there are a lot more of us men who are active dependents than we would like to admit. we're all looking around for something to be the center of our life. Something out there to be the center of our life. See? But the key that Jung's psychology helps us to see is that in a mature man, the center isn't out there. Get it? The center is in here, and it is not me. Yeah.
I was going to say that his question about codependence and how it works, there's two dynamics. There's a multiple in the dynamics take place in both conscious and unconscious parts of that relationship. You were going to talk about the triad that is formed before.
Yeah. I was going to talk about it in the context of, in family therapy, a great deal is made about triangulation. And usually, in dysfunctional families, the couple, parents, do not really relate well as a couple. They don't cooperate. In other words, they don't do a very good king and queen thing. They don't cooperate as the royal couple. So what happens is, if the husband can't empower the wife to be the queen, and the wife cannot empower the husband to be the king, then this breaks. And often the wife will turn to a son to be the little consort. And the husband will turn to a daughter to be the little consort. And if you notice in family systems, you get that going on all over the place. And those of you who've studied Freud say, aha, Freud was right about the Oedipal triangle being at the core of a lot of pathology. He absolutely, if you really understand Freud's early work and you look at family therapy, you can see a lot of the insights that Freud had coming up again in family therapy on this triangulation thing. And what you see is, you see both partners in the parental couple. Neither one of them want to share power. See, if they wanted to share power, they would empower their partners and maintain mutuality with another power center. See, that's the great challenge. I haven't had a chance to talk about the importance of the queen and all this. See? Because okay, I will then, thank you. Because see, the great temptation for either person of the conjunctio, the king or the queen, is to absorb all of the royal power into one of the genders. That's an enormous temptation. It is just incredible how big a temptation it is, because men and women have an enormously difficult time imagining a king and a queen cooperating. I get the kick out of thinking about what is the task, the mythic task of our time. A little celestial mythic marital therapy, right? So that we ought to all go home this week and try to imagine Zeus and Hera getting along. I only half jest. Because if you will look at world mythology, you can't find very many examples where the king in his fullness empowers the queen in her fullness, and vice versa. And I think that is a powerful testament to the way in which human grandiosity tends to move over into the shadow side. Because anytime you're on this side of this line, the Shadow King side, you do not want a queen in your life. You want a lot of consorts. See? And the same thing I think is true of shadow queens, of which there are millions. Shadow queens do not want a fully empowered king in their life. They want a lot of consorts. So, if Jung was right, and we're supposed to do some celestial healing through our own individuation, probably part of our task is imagining a fully empowered royal couple. See if you can do it. I've got a lot of people trying to do it. It's very difficult to do. Yeah.
Doesn't that empowering relate beyond?
Yes, it does. She's asking, doesn't that relate to anima and animus and the empowering of each other in that individuation process in a relationship? I think it's absolutely key. But you can see how hard it is once you understand the way the shadow royalty thing works. And we all got a hunk of Hades in us. I mean, let's get clear about this. We don't have to ask, do I have any of this? Once you see how hard it is to keep from being seduced into, it's like the seduced into this idea of the Judeo-Christian God, who doesn't have a wife. Think about that. Think about that. I'm always amused at that. You mean to say Yahweh doesn't have a wife? Well, then he can't be God. I mean, obviously, any man that doesn't have a woman is not as much of a man as a man that has a woman. Excuse me, Pope. I'm sorry about that. We got one more comment and then we got to go. Anybody else want to have the last word tonight? Yeah.
You may have a pessimistic last word, but it would seem immensely difficult to achieve any kind of balanced social order in any level, family or company or country or whatever. Given these complexities, we need some sort of verticality with leadership.
So. He's saying it would be extremely difficult to have any kind of social order given this kind of complexity. Absolutely. See, if you understand anything about modernity, I have just given you an understanding, a mythological take on the psychology of modernity, which shows why it's so difficult to have anything remotely approaching cosmos in modern culture. Because if you're fully modern, you don't know what to do with your grandiosity. You cannot give it to the king, the true king. Or if you're a woman, you can't give it to the true queen. Because you don't have any mythic sensibility. You have no sense of a mythic, Robert Bly goes around talking about, he says, a man, if he's going to be a man, Bly says, give Robert the last word. He says, if a man's going to be a man, he's got to get in touch with the king in the other world. That's right. And the scary bit is that's literally right. You better have a relationship with a king that is not your ego. Because if you don't have a relationship with a king that's not your ego, you're going to be crazy in one of these forms. Various degrees. And the same thing is true of women and the queen. It's not enough for a woman to have a relationship with the king in the form of her father. If she's going to be a mature woman, she's going to have to get that king thing straightened out and realize it isn't dad. And it isn't any human male. But then her task is to try to get into touch with some queen imago. And that is hard going, although it's getting easier now because a lot of women are doing more research on the goddess myths. Still a long way to go on it. We've got to stop. Next week, I will talk more about what they used to do to deal with this and what are some things we can do today in contemporary culture to relate to the king archetype instead of identify with it.
Are you interested in knowing if you embody the king in his fullness? Or if you're influenced by its more shadowy aspects? Why not take the Masculine Archetypes test? It's absolutely free and can guide you on a path of self-exploration. By gaining a deeper understanding of your personal masculine energies, you'll discover your strengths and identify areas where you can grow. Take the masculine test today at masculinetest.com.